If you've ever taken a look at Charlie Kirk's Twitter feed, one of the first things that you'll notice is how a good portion of his tweets begin with the word fact. In between the very first line that contains the word fact and the very last line that contains that incredibly overused thinking emoji is usually a very bold claim along with a very precise statistic. Fact: 98% of all mass shootings occur in gun-free zones. Fact: 97.8% of mass shootings since 1950 have occurred in gun-free zones. Fact: 97.6% of all mass shootings occur in gun-free zones. 31% of women and 17% of men making the dangerous journey to the United States southern border are sexually assaulted. Since Donald Trump repealed Obama's net neutrality law, broadband download speeds are up 38.5%. Average upload speeds are up 22%. He'll often regurgitate the same claim many times, just worded a bit differently each time, and with the figures slightly adjusted. His statistics are almost always very precise and down to the nearest tenth of a percent point in a lot of cases. This gives his followers the impression that he's interested in meticulous research and pays close attention to details, and that commitment to truth, above all else, is what motivates him to keep crusading against the cultural Marxists and blue-haired SJW feminist dance professors that are hell-bent on stripping us of our First Amendment rights.
The answer is, show me another statistic of anything I've talked about in the 300 hours that Candace and I have done, public speaking. Everything I talk about, everything I do is rooted in years of research and backing and data, and I'm happy to talk about each specific one. I don't want to monopolize the time here.
Since he very rarely provides sources to substantiate his so-called facts, he places that burden onto his followers to decide whether or not they want to accept them. More often than not, his followers accept these statistics at face value because they help confirm the worldview that is subscribed to by many on the right. While I understand that tweets are limited to a certain number of characters, it isn't really that hard to post a link in a separate tweet that provides the hard, objective data that backs up these facts that you're presenting. This purpose of this video is to highlight some of the tactics and maneuvers that are most commonly employed by Fox News' darling and man who lives like a capitalist every day.
I live like a capitalist every single day.
Charlie Kirk. These types of tactics are divided into three categories. Number 1. Baseless claims. Charlie almost never includes links to sources that support his claims. Number 2. Atrocious reasoning. This includes meaningless platitudes and basic errors in logic that enter into the realm of criminal stupidity. Number 3. Doublethink. Charlie often argues for two positions that directly contradict each other. I can't explain why all of Charlie's supposed facts are misleading or sometimes completely fabricated, because Charlie is such a prolific purveyor of bullshit, and that would be entirely too time-consuming. But I will at least explain why some of his most common talking points that masquerade as hard-to-swallow facts are misleading at best and complete bullshit at worst. First up will be the factual inaccuracies and baseless claims. The first one relates to Trump and unemployment rates. A very common talking point that Charlie likes to regurgitate is the one about how the economy is booming and how unhinged leftists are just so consumed with their anger and blind hatred for Trump that they're completely overlooking all the good that he's done for the American economy. Record low black unemployment. Record low Hispanic unemployment. Record low female unemployment. Record low number of food stamp recipients. Pretty much everyone would agree that those are all good things that are worth celebrating. But is it correct to give Trump credit for any of these accomplishments? Let's have a brief look at each of these figures and what their patterns have been over the past several years. The unemployment rate for all races peaked sometime around 2010 to 2011. After the financial crash of 2008 started to fade away, unemployment rates for all races steadily declined. By the time Trump took office in January of 2017, the unemployment rates for all races were less than half of what they were just 6 years earlier in 2011. The exact same trend is true when it comes to the number of food stamp recipients. How is it that Trump deserves credit for reducing unemployment and food stamp enrollment when that trend had already been happening for 6 years before he took office? Also, I found this relevant tweet from Charlie interesting. In it, he claims that the black unemployment rate was only 6.8% in 1968, and it was at its lowest point ever in 2018 at 7.5%. Notice how this directly contradicts his claim that Trump achieved the lowest ever black unemployment rate. How exactly did Trump achieve the lowest ever black unemployment rate of 7.5% in 2018 when it was 6.8% in 1968 like Charlie claims? Maybe it's just the case that Charlie doesn't know that 7.5 is actually greater than 6.8. But more than likely, this is a case of Charlie trying to have it both ways. He is simultaneously trying to give credit to Trump for a record low black unemployment rate, while trying to blame Democrats for increasing the unemployment rate. So, which one is it? Did the black unemployment rate used to be very low, only to rise to where it is now because of the libtards' globalist agenda? Or has the black unemployment rate always been high, and did Donald Trump bring it to where it is now? Now, Charlie certainly never appears to hesitate to blame Obama for bad stuff that's still happening now that he's no longer in office, like rising healthcare costs. But he never really seems to give him credit for the good stuff that's still happening. Could it be that Charlie only cares about the economy so long as it's politically convenient for him? Well, Charlie definitely called out the president when the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 500 points. At least when it happened under Obama, he did. But when the Dow plunged 1,175 points in February of last year, the largest single-day decline in history, Charlie was awkwardly silent. When the Dow plunged 500 points in October, Charlie was silent then too. Come to think of it, I've tried searching for some tweets from Charlie that relate to the stock market around the time when the market tanked, and I can't find anything. If you're watching this, Charlie, feel free to drop some links to some tweets in the comments section. We would really love to understand your take on how Trump is responsible for the unemployment rate being so low. The second set of baseless claims that Charlie repeats ad nauseum relates to California. Like many reactionary conservatives, one of Charlie's favourite pastimes is bashing California, sometimes referred to as Commifornia by free speech warriors. Let's take a look at a tweet from Charlie from just a few days ago. There's just so much wrong with this. California ranks 46 in education, according to Charlie. He never specifies what kind of education, though. Does this mean K through 12 education? Does this mean college education? Education by itself is kind of vague, and as usual, he hasn't provided any sources, so a lot of guesswork needs to be done. After doing a quick Google search, I found a study from the US World News and Report from 2018 that ranks each state by looking at the qualities of both their K through 12 education and their higher education. Unsurprisingly, Massachusetts ranks number 1 overall. It's number 1 in K through 12 and 29 in higher education. California ranks 26 overall. It ranks 4th for higher education and 44th for K through 12. To claim that education in California is terrible in such a blanket statement like this is to ignore jewels like Stanford, UC Berkeley, UCLA, and plenty of others. But I'm going to assume that he was just referring to K through 12 education. There isn't anything wrong with criticizing K through 12 education in California, but it's just odd that he chooses to focus almost exclusively on California because it's a blue state, when the tables could be turned quite easily by shifting the focus on Mississippi or Louisiana, or one of a number of red states that have worse education than California. According to this tweet, California also ranks 15th in crime. According to that same study from the US World News and Report, California ranks 34th for crime. That study factors in both property crime and violent crime. Like the previous point, there isn't anything wrong about pointing out that crime in California is higher than in some other places. But the trend of focusing almost exclusively on California makes it appear that Charlie's motivation for doing so is simply to score some partisan points, more than any genuine concern about victims of crimes. Charlie claims that California has the nation's highest homeless population. This is objectively true, but it's very misleading for several reasons. First, California is by far the most populous state, so it makes sense that it would have a bigger homeless population than all other states. Much more importantly, California's warm and arid climate makes it a popular destination for homeless people from all over because it's possible to live outside year-round without shelter. It never snows and it rarely rains, so it's a lot easier to be homeless out there than it is in a place like New York where it gets cold and snows. On a related note, deep blue states like New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and to a lesser extent Maine have some of the lowest rates of homelessness despite having policies that Charlie would describe as socialist. These states have low rates of homelessness, not necessarily because of generous welfare programs, but because the weather there isn't friendly to outdoor living like it is in California. As much as Charlie might like to chalk the homelessness problem up to leftists or Kamala Harris in particular, he can't do so until he explains why blue states with policies similar to California's have much lower rates of homelessness. California has the highest poverty rate. Yeah, this simply isn't true. California ranks 15th for the worst poverty. Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, Arkansas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Oklahoma and Texas all have higher poverty rates than California. Charlie conveniently ignores that though, because those are all red states. California having the worst pollution is in fact true. But again, how this is the fault of Kamala Harris or Democrats in general is beyond me, considering how Democrats are the ones that are generally more in favor of environmental regulations. The stubborn reality is that California has a lot of people packed into very small pockets along the coast. The geography of California, with its mountains and hills, with its increased risk of earthquakes, makes mass transit much more difficult to coordinate than in places where it's relatively flat like New York or Chicago. As a result, almost all of its 40 million residents who are old enough to drive actually do so, and that causes more pollution. I also can't help but laugh that a guy like Charlie, who claims that global warming is a hoax, is suddenly pretending to complain about the environment now that an opportunity to own the libs has presented itself. California having more undocumented immigrants than any other state is true, but that problem will be quickly solved if they were just granted amnesty. Charlie isn't in favor of amnesty, so he really only has himself to blame for this one. California doesn't have more debt than any other state. As of 2017, California has $38 billion in debt. Illinois has $150 billion in debt, and New Jersey has about $150 billion in debt. Although California's debt is relatively large in comparison to other states, California's GDP is also larger than most states. The claim that someone can be incarcerated for misgendering someone is patently false. And the part about there being no jail time for spreading HIV isn't true. What is true, however, is that the penalty for spreading HIV in California has been reduced from an 8-year felony to a misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail. This is largely due to AIDS no longer being a life-threatening illness anymore. In addition to being much more treatable, drugs like PrEP have drastically reduced the risk of contracting HIV. Finally, Democrats run California. This is true if you focus solely on coastal California. However, inland California can be very conservative. Even at the entire state level, this statement isn't true. Within the past 50 years, California has been governed by a Republican governor for 29 of those years. Lastly, and most importantly, California has the world's fifth largest economy, and there are more millionaires in California than any other state. That's not to say that California doesn't have its own unique set of problems that it has to deal with. But it strikes me as a bit odd that Charlie would use this talking point as a way to strike fear into the hearts of voters by saying that if they vote for Kamala Harris, she'll turn the country into California. If turning the US into California means the rest of the states will have enormous economies, then most people would probably be on board, myself included. Next, we'll be focusing on the utterly atrocious logic that Charlie commonly employs in the service of propping up his lame agenda. This includes the scorching hot takes and truth bombs from Charlie that truly put him in a league of his own. It isn't hard to see why Fox News continues to have him on as a guest when Charlie delivers gems like these. Charlie certainly doesn't take any prisoners. If God wasn't real, then there wouldn't be any atheists. So, the fact that there are people who don't think that God is real is proof that God is in fact real? Not exactly following that. Let's extend that very same line of reasoning to something else like Islam, for example. The fact that Charlie doesn't think that the Islamic God is real should serve as proof that Allah is real, right? How about Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or UFOs? Is the fact that there are people who think that all of these things aren't real proof that they are real? This is just one of many cases where Charlie Kirk enters the realm of self-parody. The amount of blind faith it takes to be an atheist never ceases to amaze me. This platitude is one that is a favourite amongst evangelical Christians like Charlie, and it's one that doesn't make any sense either. Atheism isn't a belief system, it's a lack of belief. Atheism isn't the belief that there is no God. Rather, it's the belief that there isn't enough evidence to support the existence of God. Although there are some militant atheists who take a more hardline approach by claiming that they know with absolute certainty that there is no God, most atheists don't go that far. There could very well be a God, but there just isn't enough evidence to support the existence of one right now. Beliefs will change as new evidence comes in. At its core, this tired talking point is an attempt to place the burden of proof on atheists to prove that there is no God, when in reality, most atheists don't ever claim such a thing. It is up to the person who is making the claim to provide evidence in support of that claim. No one is under any obligation to believe something simply because it hasn't been proven false. Kirk even admits this in a tweet. But rather than muster up some proof for the existence of God himself, Charlie tries to place the burden of disproving God squarely on those who think there is insufficient evidence. Let's take a quick look at how this tactic of reversing the burden of proof might unfold in a face-to-face interaction. In this clip, we'll look at how a couple of Qanon folks respond when they're asked to justify their outlandish beliefs.
The storm is here, QAnon. What does that mean to you?
Well, I've been following all the posts since October 28th.
On the internet, from QAnon.
Right, started on
the person or
4chan.
people who say they're Q.
Right.
What do you think Q is, by the way?
It's an entity of 10 or less people that have
involved with the government?
high clearance, security clearance.
And how do you know that?
Well, I'm just telling you, this is what it appears to be.
What it appears to be. So you don't have any
Yeah.
proof of that, that's what you're guessing it is.
And you don't have any proof there isn't.
We've all been gathering online and talking together as Americans and uniting and...
Do you think it's maybe just it makes you comfortable talking with other frustrated, sometimes
Yes,
angry people?
yes.
But maybe it's not true because there's no evidence of it. It's just stuff being talked about on the internet, right?
There hasn't been any non-evidence yet.
Rather than provide evidence that the Qanon conspiracy is real, they expect others to prove that it isn't real. And until someone explicitly proves that their outrageous beliefs are wrong, they're just going to assume that they're correct. Replace Qanon with God, and you pretty much have Charlie Kirk's argument here in a nutshell. We are not a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of citizens. This is kind of like saying, I didn't move to my new home, I live in it. Or, I didn't purchase my car, I own it. Yes, we are a nation of citizens, but where do you think these citizens come from? They migrated to the US from other countries and now they're citizens. Strangely enough, Charlie wants to make it more difficult to become a citizen. Next, we'll be focusing on the arguments that Charlie makes that directly contradict each other. Charlie either doesn't have the mental capacity to recognize how what he's saying is a contradiction, or he simply does not care. Is Europe socialist or capitalist? The tactic of labeling your ideological adversary a communist or a socialist worked well in the days of the Cold War. It worked well in those days because, unlike today, critics of communism could actually point to an example of a brutal communist regime that inflicted death and misery on many of its own citizens. Today, however, it's a lot harder to point to an example of a communist country that suppresses the rights of its citizens on a massive scale like the Soviet Union once did. There are still 5 communist countries that remain in the world as of 2019. But since the 1980s, China has gradually molded into something that resembles a state capitalist society much more than a communist one. Even Cuba is gradually opening up now that Fidel Castro has died. When most democratic socialists in the year 2019 are asked to provide examples of countries that foot the bill for a well-known socialist state, they'll probably respond with countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden or Norway. Sometimes they might say Germany. But almost none of them will concede that Mao's China or Stalin's Russia were good examples of well-run communist countries that the US should aspire to be like one day. Conservatives don't understand this because they still haven't gotten the news that the Cold War is over. So whenever they hear the word socialist, it immediately conjures up images of gulags and breadlines. In fact, since the Cold War has ended, it seems like the criteria for being a socialist country has changed quite a bit. Countries that were firmly on the western side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War are now thought of as socialist or communist by right-wingers. France, Germany, Britain and Scandinavia, Denmark in particular, have been some of the right's favourite punching bags for years now. They're criticised for being culturally Marxist because they accept refugees and promote multicultural societies. They're criticised as being socialist and sometimes communist because they tend to have more robust social safety nets and higher taxes on the wealthy. Take a look at this clip from a Q&A session at a Turning Point USA event in January 2017 and listen to what Charlie has to say about Europe.
Oftentimes in debate, people mention that the US should mimic policies that are having success in other countries like European countries, Finland's education system, or the UK's NHS. So my question is, do you think that policies like this could translate to success in the United States, even though we're not as homogenous as these nations are?
No, we're not Europe. We never should be. God, no. Are you kidding me? We're better than them, and I don't want to be them. Look, and I speak very passionately about this. If you want to just be okay, be mediocre, and get taken care of, go over there. Honestly, leave. Because we're never going to be that, and we're going to fight to our death not to become that. To become a social welfare democracy where we can vote our rights away, and vote our freedom away, and vote our liberty away. We're a country where you could start with nothing and create anything in your dreams, and to overcome incredible adversity, and to become, in your wildest imagination, rich not just in the wealth capacity, but rich in artistic ability, rich in creative capacity, rich in any other way that you want to be. And what happens in these European social democracies where you have the agency for welfare, and you have the agency, you have like a minister of this and a minister of that, and you have all these government agencies and 90% tax rates, and they take off the month of August, and no one wants to start businesses, is the morale of the country just continues to go down, and the expectations go down, and people don't think big, and they lower their expectations. There's a reason why the most wealthy countries companies in the world. 92 out of the top 100 most valuable companies in the world come out of the United States. We have 5% of the world's population, yet we lead in culture, and we lead in business, and we lead in the economy, and we lead in every single facet of industry. When there's a problem, they don't call Europe and be like, oh, we got to fix this. They call the United States of America. We have 5% of the world. We have 5% of the world's population, yet everybody wants to be here. There's a last thing. When someone from the Middle East goes to Europe, they keep that culture. When they come to America, they become an American. Because we embrace all these different values and cultures and perspectives and languages as long as you want to improve your life and contribute to the greatest country in the history of the world. So the answer to your question is absolutely not.
And here's Charlie's appearance on the Rubin report from January 2018, where he essentially echoes that same sentiment.
The fight for the soul of the country, and it has to start on college campuses, and it's really the struggle for our generation. And it's really, if you divide it, it's do we believe America is the greatest country in the history of the world, and do we believe freedom is a good thing, or do we want to go a completely different direction that looks much more like a European socialist democracy that does not honor civil liberties, that does not honor private property, and really deteriorates everything that made America a great place? That's the decision our generation has to make.
It's kind of funny. You're sort of like the non-Silicon Valley version of like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, the guy that didn't go to college or dropped out of college, but now you're.
Notice how Charlie paints such a grim picture as he describes Europe as a socialist welfare state where property rights aren't respected and civil liberties aren't honoured. Sounds pretty awful there, actually. Also, that part where Dave describes Charlie as the non-Silicon Valley version of Steve Jobs had me cringing so hard. A YouTuber by the name of Timber on Toast has a great 3-part series where he delivers a scathing review of the Rubin report, and one of his criticisms is how Dave constantly showers his guests with praise and adoration in an attempt to make their views more palatable, sometimes even to a level that borders on sycophancy. I think this is a great example of Dave doing exactly that. On a side note, it appears that Charlie's partner in crime, Candace Owens, must have taken that comment about Charlie being the next Steve Jobs pretty seriously, because she compared Turning Point USA to an Ascent Apple just 6 months later. In my own humble estimation, Charlie is more like a non-festival version of Billy McFarland, but I digress. Back to Europe for now. Try to square what Charlie had to say about Europe being a socialist hellhole with how Charlie describes Scandinavia in April of this year.
So I would agree with you that authoritarian socialist states like Cuba and Venezuela have been disasters. But if you look at the Scandinavian social democracies, they outperform the U.S. on all.
You don't want to go down this rabbit hole, my friend.
The myth of the Scandinavian socialism.
Yeah, they outperform the U.S. in GDP per capita, education outcomes, and life expectancy.
Still going down the path.
So let's ask
Charlie
the question.
Kirk.
World Economic Freedom Index, which ranks each country by how much economic freedom there is. You do know that Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark rank higher than the United States. They have more economic freedom. That is not socialist. That is capitalist. In many ways, the Scandinavian countries are more capitalistic than we are. Where they're not is where is universal health care, or they give out a bunch of stuff. I don't want to live in a country with a 70% tax rate, but as far as you rank the Economic Freedom Index, they're much higher. So you would support the deregulation of the economy, the repealing of Dodd-Frank, the lowering of small business taxes, the abolition of the FICA tax. You would support all these things, which are inherently anti-socialist, inherently anti-democrat. Would you support those things?
Wow, so within 15 months, Europe went from being a socialist hellhole where civil liberties aren't honoured and property rights aren't respected, to being more capitalist and economically freer than the world's supposed bastion of unbridled capitalism, the United States. So, what happened? Well, nothing really. The right hasn't been able to answer the Scandinavian question for years now, and they've been reflexively writing off anyone who disagrees with them on issues like taxation, regulation and social welfare as communists for so long that by the time some legitimate examples of social democracies appeared on the radar, they were left ill-equipped to provide a compelling answer. Charlie's approach to this is rather interesting. In all honesty, I think if he had simply denied that the quality of life in Scandinavia is very good, it would have worked out a lot better for him. It's not like it would have been the first time that he had boldly denied an almost universally accepted truth. Charlie is a guy who denies basic truths like the Earth is getting warmer and that the Earth is older than 6,000 years old all the time. So, if he had simply denied that Scandinavia has a very good quality of life, it wouldn't have been that out of the ordinary. But rather than choose to deny, Charlie has fully admitted that Scandinavia has a lot going for it. But with one very crucial twist. His contention is that the real reason things are good in Scandinavia is because, despite conventional wisdom, they actually have capitalist economies and not socialist ones. The problem is that in taking that route, it totally contradicts everything he has been saying for the past years about Europe being a socialist shithole. In fairness, many on the right have been caught up in the exact same sort of doublethink as it relates to Scandinavia, and Charlie was likely just doing what he does best, which is parroting tired talking points to gullible millennial conservatives who desperately want their opinions validated. Take a look at this sizzling hot take courtesy of PragerU. It's the exact same thing. In 2016, PragerU claimed that progressives were motivated by a sinister desire to transform the US into a European-styled socialist welfare state. Flash forward 3 years to 2019, and PragerU is claiming that there aren't any socialist states in Europe and that Denmark is really a capitalist country. At this point, I think it's safe to say that conservatives really cannot make up their minds about Europe. If you support a European-style healthcare system, then you're a socialist and should just move to Europe, claims the right. However, none of those countries with universal healthcare in Europe are actually socialist. Just pick one, guys. Next up is the topic of Amazon subsidies. This example of doublethink is a particularly interesting one because it is one of the rare occasions where Charlie is in agreement with one of his ideological opponents, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. For those of you who may not be familiar with Amazon's HQ2, let me provide a brief background. In September 2017, Amazon announced plans to build a new headquarters. Amazon claimed that the new HQ2 would house 50,000 employees and cost $5 billion in construction. Cities all around the US competed to be the location of the new headquarters, offering generous tax breaks as incentives. In January of 2019, it was announced that New York City would be home to the new HQ2. One of the most vocal critics of the new HQ2 was freshman Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, sometimes referred to by her initials, AOC. The fact that a self-avowed democratic socialist like AOC would oppose given tax breaks to Amazon wasn't particularly surprising. Most, if not all democratic socialists opposed tax benefits for wealthy corporations. So AOC opposing the Amazon deal wasn't really a departure from her ideology. The same cannot be said of Charlie, though. Most conservatives are perfectly content with granting tax breaks, especially to high-income earners and big corporations. So the fact that Charlie came out against the Amazon deal was a bit telling. Charlie claims that the reason he was against the Amazon deal was because government subsidies are funded by taxpayers and therefore constitute cronyism and run counter to the free market values that he claims to be so fond of. However, there is an argument to be made in favour of the Amazon deal. For one, the construction of a new headquarters would provide lots of construction jobs. It would also provide new jobs for Amazon employees who would likely invest money in the local economy. It's possible that the $5 billion in tax breaks for Amazon would have resulted in even more gains for everyone as a whole. Charlie even admits this during a talk in Israel, where he claims that the $5 billion in aid that America sends Israel each year results in more benefits for everyone.
Secondly, it's important to remember that the American economy is benefited by a peaceful Israel. There is billions and billions of dollars a day of positive economic progress that happens between America and Israel, whether it be medical advancements, patent breakthroughs, Technion University. Waze, for example, was innovated here by an Israeli entrepreneur. So there is an economic argument that the $5 billion or whatever it is, $5.8 billion that America spends on aid in Israel, we get back in tens of billions, hundreds of billions in economic productivity and output.
Whether or not the costs outweigh the benefits isn't something that I've looked into, and I don't know what the answer is. But Charlie's deviation from the standard conservative position on taxes and economics is worth noting. Does Charlie dislike subsidies, or does he simply dislike who is receiving these subsidies? Why does Charlie oppose the Amazon deal? Well, in short, Charlie doesn't support the Amazon deal because Trump doesn't support the Amazon deal. Charlie supports Trump's policies 99.9% of the time, and the Amazon deal is no exception. Charlie's jobs is essentially to offer apologetics for the president's actions, regardless of how nonsensical or unethical they may be. So, to find out the long answer to this question, what we really need to ask is, why does Trump oppose the Amazon deal? Let's take a brief look at Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos was born Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen on January 12, 1964 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the son of Jacqueline Geese Jorgensen and Chicago, Illinois native Ted Jorgensen. At the time of his birth, his mother was a 17-year-old high school student and his father was a bike shop owner. After Jacqueline divorced Ted, she married Cuban immigrant Miguel Bezos in April 1968. Shortly after the wedding, Mike adopted 4-year-old Jorgensen, whose surname was then changed to Bezos. Unlike Trump, Bezos wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't receive $1 million for his 18th birthday, and his parents weren't multi-millionaire real estate developers in Manhattan. His beginnings were very humble in comparison to Trump's. He graduated valedictorian from his high school in 1982. He later went on to study at Princeton. In 1994, he founded Amazon from his garage, and it is now one of the world's most successful companies. Bezos is currently estimated to be worth $160 billion. Compare that to Trump's net worth of only $3 billion. Of course, it's hard to know how much Trump is really worth because he refuses to release his tax returns. But most estimates put his net worth somewhere in the ballpark of $3 to $4 billion, considerably less than Bezos's fortune. Bezos also doesn't have a past that's littered with bankruptcies. In short, Bezos is a legitimate businessman and not just a trust fund kid who plays one on TV. Bezos also owns the Washington Post, a very popular and reputable newspaper that has been very critical of Trump on the campaign trail and during his presidency. It's easy to see how a narcissistic guy like Trump would have had his ego bruised if Amazon decided to set up shop in Trump's hometown of New York City. So when Trump opposed it, it became Charlie's unofficial duty to work out the mental gymnastics of how to support subsidies while opposing them at the same time. Back to AOC. One might be tempted to think that since Charlie and AOC were both in agreement on the Amazon deal, that they should strike some common ground and use that to weaken the political divide. But that isn't what happened. A mere 2 days after tweeting that the Amazon deal was cronyism and that Trump should block it, Charlie blamed AOC for losing over 25,000 jobs thanks to Amazon pulling out of New York City. This tweet speaks volumes about the kind of person Charlie is. For one, his ignorance of elected officials' power was on full display. Trump didn't have the authority to block this Amazon deal, neither did AOC. Contrary to popular opinion, the location that Amazon had selected for its new HQ2 in Jackson Heights, Queens, wasn't even in AOC's congressional district. Her district is the one directly north of the one that HQ2 was set to be in. Even though AOC was a very vocal opponent of the deal, and her public opposition to it galvanized many of her followers to protest, she didn't have any legal authority to stop the Amazon deal. Lastly, and most importantly, how on earth could Charlie criticize someone for supporting the same position that he supports for the exact same set of reasons? This is just one of many examples of Charlie trying to score some cheap partisan political points at the expense of one of his opponents, but failing miserably. biology and resurrections. As many of you already know, Charlie Kirk makes no secret of the fact that he's an evangelical Christian. Charlie is all that you would expect and then some more from a self-described born-again Christian. He thinks the earth is only 6,000 years old. He claims to fully believe the story of Jesus' resurrection and believes that virgins can give birth. As nonsensical as all of this may be, I generally don't have a problem with other people's religious beliefs, so long as they aren't being forced on anyone else. What's very interesting about Charlie, though, is how when he is presented with an opportunity to bash trans people, he suddenly claims to have a renewed interest in biology. To be clear, it's 2019, and I'm just going to assume that I don't need to explain to grown adults why some rising from the dead and a virgin giving birth aren't consistent with anything we've come to understand about how biology works. Honestly, if Charlie was just honest and admitted that he wanted to hate on trans people for no good reason, I'd probably respect him a little bit more. Not saying that I'd ever respect his bigotry, but I'd at least respect the fact that he didn't insult my intelligence by pretending to actually care about what biology has to say or what he thinks biology has to say, and then using the supposed concern as a pretense to hate on marginalized groups. If Charlie wants to be a bigot, then he should just be honest about it. Don't claim to care about biology when it's convenient for you and then ignore it when it disproves your Iron Age myths. Where do rights come from? In a video from June 2018 titled "Government Does Not Give You Your Rights," Charlie describes his views on human rights. He claims that upon birth, rights are granted and that they can't be taken away by governments. Similarly, Charlie also claims that rights aren't given by governments either. Kirk claims that it's common for libertarian and conservative types to support this theory of natural rights, and he's not wrong about that.
Where do rights come from? Are they administered by a government bureaucrat? Are they given to you by your parents? So those of us that are conservatarians, we believe in natural rights. Upon birth, upon creation, you have the rights. They can neither be taken away, they can never be given out, they cannot be distributed. So what does that mean?
In his 1974 book, Anarchy, State and Utopia, Harvard University professor and libertarian Robert Nozick argued that the ideal role of government is limited to that of a night watchman state with powers limited to those necessary to protect their citizens against violence, theft and fraud. Following the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, Nozick assumes that everyone possesses the natural rights to life, liberty and property. Square Kirk's remarks about natural rights with a clip from less than 2 months later, in July 2018, where he claims that undocumented immigrants don't have any rights because they aren't here legally.
Have you lost human rights?
No, but you're an animal. And by the way, they never had rights in the first place because they're illegals. We do not grant rights to foreign nationals.
This is confusing, to say the least. On the one hand, Charlie says that rights aren't given by governments. On the other hand, he says that non-citizens don't have any rights. How can that be? Isn't a right supposed to be something that we're all born with? If Charlie had actually read Anarchy, State and Utopia, he'd know that Nozick argues that the right to exclude is a right held by individual property owners, not governments. Individual property owners may do what they'd like with their property. This could include not renting to certain people or not hiring certain groups of people. But when the property is owned by the collective, restrictions against certain groups of people cannot be made. Charlie claims to have had his libertarian ideals confirmed after reading works by Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek. But the more that I hear from him, the more I think he's bullshitting. He likely hasn't read a book in ages. Charlie, if you're watching this, please offer us a little clarity. You know how to respond.